Hey guys, welcome back. It's our third day of our study of 3rd John. We've covered the summary. We've covered the first main point of rejoicing in the truth and how John was gracious, not gracious, but that he was glad that Gaius was walking in the truth. Today we're going to look at reliability for travelers, verses 5 to 8. Let's read those and we'll get into it. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well, because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers of the truth. We see reliability for the travelers. We see 3 points under this about Gaius. First, that he was faithful. Gaius was faithful. We see this in verse 5. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. And that's who it is. Our points under here. He was faithful to the church and he was faithful to strangers. Gaius was welcoming. He was loving. He was inviting and hospitable. When somebody needed a place to stay, Gaius said, hey, come on over. I got a place for you. You're always welcome at my house. And you can imagine as an itinerant preacher going around to places, that'd be a welcome thing, a relieving thing, to know that you're going to be taken care of. You're going to be provided for while you're staying here and ministering to the church. That is a wonderful thing. But it wasn't just to those that were from the area or even necessarily itinerant preachers, but to anybody, strangers who needed a place to stay, who needed a warm meal, who needed the gospel of Christ. He would invite them in and say, hey, come on in. I got food for you. I got a warm bed for you. You can stay with me while you're in town doing business or whatever it is. And we'll talk about Christ and your eternal soul and things of that sort. So Gaius was faithful. Gaius's faithfulness was witnessed. Now, if you act like this and you're in the church doing this, it's going to get noticed. People notice what he was doing. It was witnessed in verse 6 before the church, which have borne witness of thy charity. So the brethren and the strangers in verse 5 have borne witness of thy charity before the church. They've come in the church and says, hey guys, I just want you to know how great Gaius is. He's welcomed me into your place, into his home and into your church. And I just love that. I appreciate that from Gaius. It was witnessed before the church. Secondly, in verses 6 and 7, it was witnessed before God. Because if it's done before the church, God's going to see it. Whom, this is talking about the brethren and the strangers, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. You better mark it. If you are helping somebody get the gospel out, God's going to take notice of you. If you are hindering somebody that is getting the gospel out, God's going to take notice of that too. Gaius was in the first category. He was helping those people who were going around and preaching the gospel. He was helping them by providing a place to stay, providing meals for them. And in verse 6 it says, if you bring them forward, if you bring them along on their journey and help them on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Now we need to remember from 2 John last week that if they're not teaching the truth, we don't have anything to do with them. But if we talk to them and they're teaching the truth, then we help them on our way. We do well and we are blessed by God from that. So we see that he was, his faithfulness was witnessed before the church, before God, and third, before the Gentiles. Now, what does that mean? Well, in verse 7, it says, talking about these itinerant preachers, because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is after Paul's manner. So Paul, whenever he went around preaching the gospel from town to town, city to city, as an itinerant preacher, if you will, on his missionary journeys, he would not come into the Gentiles and start the church and say, okay, now that we have a church, you need to pay me. Because what would happen is all the Gentiles in the area that weren't Christians would see that and say, oh, Paul's only doing that to get paid. It's just a scam. He's saying, oh yeah, come in and be a Christian so that I can get your money. Paul was smart of that, and he didn't do that. When he was able to, when he had to, I should say, he worked as a tent maker, as we see when he first came to the church at Corinth in Acts 18, he worked with his hands with Aquila and Priscilla, who were fellow tent makers, fellow leather workers, if you will, and he made tents so that he could earn his living, so that he could preach the gospel, so he wouldn't be a weight, a hindrance to the early church. And that caught on. Now, once the church was fully established, once it was growing, Paul then turns and says, look, if you're able to, you need to take care of those who preach the gospel, those who labor in the word and in doctrine. But in that early church, and that newfound church, it's not for money, it's for the gospel. And finally, in Acts 18, Timothy and Luke come along, and they bring an offering from the churches of Macedonia to Paul in Corinth, and then he's able to stop leather working, stop tent making, and focus full time on preaching the gospel. Well, that's what he's saying here. Because, verse 7, that for his name's sake, for Christ's sake, these itinerant preachers went forth, taking nothing of Gentiles. They went on their own money and their own effort. They didn't try to rob the church or the new Christians. They said, we're going to follow the pattern of Paul and let God provide for us and work with our own hands so that we are not a hindrance to people being saved. So they did this. His faithfulness was witnessed before the Gentiles, because these itinerant preachers would come in and say, I just had this great time in Corinth or wherever Gaius was. I had this great time with him, and he provided for me so that I am able to come here today to present the gospel to you. Gaius' faithfulness was a testimony that was testified before the church, before God, and before the Gentiles. Third point under this one, under reliability for travelers, is that Gaius was a fellow helper. We see this in verse 8. And this is John saying, look, we need to do this. You need to keep going with this, guys. This is a good thing. We therefore ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers of the truth. Our main purpose in life as Christians is to see the lost saved. Why else are we here? Yes, we're to be Christ-like, we're to be growing in him, but our main purpose is to see other people saved. If we see an opportunity to help somebody in that endeavor, we need to help that. We need to help them. We need to encourage them. We need to provide for them if we can, so that we might be fellow helpers. There's no greater cause in the world today than the evangelization of the lost. And we need to be about that. So make sure that you today are like Gaius. Make sure that you're faithful to those who are in the church and those who are outside of the church, so that your faithfulness is witness to those in the church, to God himself, and to those who are outside the church, so that your testimony is magnified, so that Christ is glorified and your testimony is believed better. And make sure that you are a fellow helper in reaching the lost with the gospel. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. We'll talk tomorrow about remembering treatment and talking about Diotrephes and all that was going on with him. Have a great day. Thanks.